Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Legacy of Segregated Schools for the Blind with Dina Lambert. We're so excited to have her here. Unfortunately, her father, Arthur Ray, was not able to make it, but we are very excited to have this discussion. I am joined today by my esteemed colleague, Kyla Hannington, the Outreach Coordinator for the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. My name is O. Horvath. I'm here representing the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, and we have been thrilled over the pandemic and into the future to collaborate with PGCOHR on a whole host of events centering community members and figures that are advancing important conversations and changing our world. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce Dina Lambert. Dina Lambert has been a Greenbelt resident since 2004 after moving from Little Rock, Arkansas, where she was born and raised by her parents Arthur and Vivian Lambert. Since 2004, she has been actively involved in various organizations in the community, from serving as a co-leader for a Greenbelt Daisy School Girl Scout troop, to supporting the Greenbelt Makerspace First robotics team for 2 years. Currently, Dina serves as Vice President of Greenbelt Homes Incorporated. Her personal research is focused on sharing the lived experience of blind individuals from communities of color. She is currently applying for funding to continue the research, which will culminate in a documentary that shares the stories of students who attended segregated schools for the blind. She is a program manager with NASA Goddard and previously provided overall leadership in disability law, special education policy, STEM recruitment, and federal program compliance. Her professional interests also include mediation, collaborative partnerships, a little different, community outreach, and social policy. She's a graduate of the George Washington University, where she earned a Master of Public Administration. She has a 2-year-old son named Caleb and a 9-year-old Labrador named Angie. Thank you so much, Dina, for joining us. And without further ado, I will pass over the mic to Kyla to begin this awesome conversation.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, O, and thank you, as always, to Prince George's County Memorial Library System for being such fantastic partners. We're thrilled to be here. And Dina, I'm so excited that you are here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Though I might need to add meditation to my phosphorus skills.
Meditation and mediation.
Yes.
Those are both extremely useful skills. So we're here tonight, to talk about Legacy of Segregated Schools for the Blind. And I do just want to address something for all of our flyers that we sent out. We included your dad because originally we were going to have your dad. And so first of all, Mr. Lambert, if you're listening, we are so delighted just to hear from Dina and to hear the story and appreciate this opportunity to chat. So I know that your father went to a segregated school for the blind, and that's how you got interested in them? Or can you tell us a little bit about the schools? And
well, yeah. So my dad is legally blind. So by law, he is blind with vision no greater than 2200. So basically, you do not want him driving on the streets, and me either as well, because I am also blind and I have residual vision. It was something that his family noticed, and also his teachers. He originally attended public school in Monticello, Arkansas, which is small Delta town just north of the Louisiana border. And for 4.5 years, his teachers noticed that he wasn't quite, getting the information that was being presented. And so that his family they were notified that there was actually a school for the blind, a residential school for the blind that he could go to receive the education that he needed. So that's where he went to school until he graduated. And ultimately, that's where my parents, my mom and dad, had to make a decision whether I would attend a public school or to attend the school for the blind like he did. But given that the environments had changed at that point and the schools were integrated at that point.
So your dad's school was a residential school. It's like a boarding school.
Yes. So actually, most schools for the blind. So now we are incredibly I don't know if the right word is lucky, but with the emergence of laws like the IDEA, Americans with Disabilities Act, there have been significant improvements to access to educational opportunities in local schools. Mm-hmm. So for my son, who's a 2-year-old, if he were to ever need special education services, I would be fairly confident that he could get those services at the school down the street. Mm-hmm. But back in the 1940s, when my dad was growing up, that was not the case. They did not have Braille books. They didn't have the technology. It just didn't exist. So it was in one centralized location, and that was pretty common for a number of the schools for the blind. They became residential schools where students would go to at the end of August, beginning of September. They would stay there until, let's say, Christmas or the holidays, and then return back to school for the winter semester in January, and then stay there until June. And that was kind of the pattern that a number of the schools had. The enrollment rates for a number of the schools for the blind, each state had its own school for blind children. So let's step back. The first school for the blind, both children of color and white children actually attended the school together. So the first school in 1872 was created in Boston.
So would children from all over the nation get sent to that school?
In the region, yes. But as the schools were created in each state, and actually the American Printing House for the Blind was created around that time, I think around 1840, to actually produce materials and keep track of the educational opportunities of blind children. So that's where you saw more states starting in the north and then matriculating down to the south, establish their own schools. But we had a thing called a Civil War, and that's where, as a society, it was believed that white students needed their own space, Black students had a separate space. So that's where, for the schools that were in existence at that time, either there were separate buildings or separate rooms, and those Black students would go to. And then in the South, you started to see almost separate campuses for those students. And actually, Maryland had its own segregated school for the blind that was established in, I believe, 1872, I believe, if I'm correct.
Wow, okay. And that was a segregated school. So were there 2 campuses of the same school or 2 entirely different schools?
And I believe it was 2 separate campuses. In Maryland, there actually is 2 separate campuses to this day of the Maryland School for the Blind, one in Frederick and I think one outside of Baltimore. So for my now, what you see is that students can go home each week. They usually have like a bus system or charter system that will take students home on Fridays, return them on Sunday, so they get a sense of access to their family throughout the year. But when my dad was going to school, it was very much like a boarding school, of leaving in August or September, coming back in June.
So like that's a big family disruption, because he was he was 5, or how old was he?
He was, I think, around 8 or 9 years old, I believe.
Okay.
And so my dad and I both have congenital cataracts. So that means that, with large print, holding up a page really close, we can see some things, but far away, it's just a blur. It just doesn't exist at all. So for my grandparents, they were faced with the decision of, do we keep our son here locally and face the idea that he will be uneducated, or sending him to a school more than 100 miles away where he could be educated. And I know that was a very big decision. But for many, and it's an interesting thing, now we look at segregated schools for the blind as being a very negative thing. Like, why would we do that? But as you have to look at the attitudes at the time, it was either no education or some education. And so it is better to have some education than none. And so for my grandparents and for many Black families, sometimes blind children were seen as the more educated of children in their family because they did have access to some type of education. It may not be what we would expect now for any child, whether they're blind or not, but it was something. So that was the decision that they were facing. So actually, in some of the research that I've done, it's interesting to see that Black churches, which in the Black community in the 1800s, 1900s, they were like the staple. They were the social capital within the community, especially in the South. That's where you got your education. That's where you got your information, a sense of community. Those are the ones that advocated for the separate but equal kind of philosophy at the time, until it was challenged later on when we had things like Brown versus the Board of Education that really challenged that view. Is separate but equal really, is it proper? So actually in the research I've done, actually the last school for the blind, it was closed in Louisiana in the late 1970s. I think it was 1979. It actually still existed until then.
And so, I mean, this is such a fascinating subject, and it sounds, I mean, just to do the research across the nation, like how big is the project? Actually, if we can you tell us about the project you're working on and the scope of that? Because I'm just getting the sense that it's enormous.
So definitely, I'm looking for any historians out there that are willing to, just be curious with me. But what kind of prompted this is that my dad, he's 79, and he would talk to me about what it was like. They had a house mother, and actually back then, the teachers of those schools for the blind, they were graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. We're now hearing a lot about HBCUs now because of our Vice President, Kamala Harris, but there's been a long history of, prominent leaders and educators from HBCUs. And that's where you also find that in the segregated schools for the blind. So those teachers, they became like their mothers away from home. Mothers and fathers. And so my dad would talk about going to athletic events. He would talk about going to, downtown Little Rock to get a suit and getting job interviewing skills. And I'm like, whoa, this is really interesting. And over time, I would meet his classmates. But now that I turned 40 years old, I would say around 32, 33, his classmates were passing on. They were dying. And so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how do we as a, community, how do we kind of get these individual stories if they are a generation that is fading? So the thought was, okay, can I, originally my thought was to go and visit some of the original sites of the schools for the blind, about 5 or 6, states, and then actually go and interview family members and hopefully students, if those were the students that were particularly in Louisiana and Mississippi, where the schools for the blind still existed until the the 60s, 70s, and on into the 80s. Actually, Ray Charles went to the segregated well, it was the Florida Negro School for the Blind, I believe that's the official title. So that was my dad's generation.
Yeah.
So so that's where I'm hoping is that to create an oral history that can be archived and documented, and then create a documentary kind of showcasing that this was an interesting part of kind of the American experience, that while it was I don't want to say tragic in some ways, but there's also a lot of like I would say resilience in it, because of the resources or lack of resources those teachers and students had, but they still were, in the pursuit of education and knowledge and, ultimately a better life.
Right. And providing rich opportunity, or hopefully providing rich opportunities for students. Hopefully, am I being too optimistic?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
So. Yeah, I think so. Because my dad, he talked about, doing physical education, and for many academies and schools for the blind, both for those who were white and those who were segregated, they were led by blind adults who either got their degrees from universities or academies, and they were the lead teachers, they were the principals. Actually, my music teacher was my dad's principal. So
Okay. So
my piano teacher, Mr. Cersei Yule, was the principal of the segregated schools for the blind until the school was integrated, and then unfortunately, he was moved to a less, I would say, a step down leadership position,
right.
For what his qualifications were.
Right.
But I got a chance to hear of just the campus life that they had, which was just fascinating in a way.
So can you tell us about that? What can you give us some stories?
So I know my dad, he mentioned that, they didn't have like, the sport regulation, basketball or volleyball. So what they did is that they used the old braille books that were either missing pages or whatever, and they would actually crumple it up into a ball so that it would make a sound. They would either put a bell in it or something in it, so that was their ball. They were creative in the materials that they used, and that's where they learned to play a sport called goalball, which is specifically for blind individuals. It's kind of like I don't want to say dodgeball, but it kind of is like dodgeball. Okay. But it is an Olympic sport. They learned how to play instruments. They went and played at churches and at, I don't want to say clubs, because even though my dad, he played in clubs later, but he got his educational background at the School for the Blind. And for many of them, they went on to college. It's kind of interesting to find out what these individuals did. A lot of them went back to their communities. And that's a little bit of a sad story, because many of them face the larger societal views of what blind people could do. So while you're the challenge that many students face when you go into a residential environment is that it becomes a very nurturing environment. It becomes a safe space to grow and flourish with others that have similar experiences like you. So for someone who has some vision or is in the process of losing their vision, there's that shared experience or that common knowledge. But when you go outside of that, blindness is at times considered a low incidence disability. We have to kind of think, how many blind people do you know? Are they much older? Usually they're kind of our grandparents. And, at that age, you're not doing the things like maybe having a family or employed in some way. So for many of them, they did have to face those kind of attitudinal barriers for gaining employment, gaining leadership roles within their communities, but many of them actually did. And that's part of the work that I want to do, is to find out what happened.
Right. Like to follow those stories all the way through.
Yeah.
I think it sounds fascinating. I think you've hit on something that, I think is so relevant to the present day. I mean, it would, and sadly relevant in the sense that I think those biases as it relates to visually impaired or blind people in terms of job performance, or, basically I realize that the ADA is in place, but I do not think that precludes some employers from underestimating the capacity of visually impaired and blind people. And is that, what's your sense of that? If you looking at your dad's experience and the experience of people in his generation, and what you see around, the folks that and what you're experiencing, is that something that, do you see a transition there?
So actually, at many of the schools for the blind, they had, I don't want to call it vocational programs, but it was called the industrial arts. So they had kind of these career tracks that many of the students, they were kind of seen as like the non-visual career fields, like piano tuning, chair caning, or massage. There were definitely a lot of students that went in that route. Actually, my dad, I think he was initially going for training as a masseur, but I don't think he would face a lot of challenges as a Black man, trying to, have a career in massage therapy in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
So now with the advancement of technology, for myself, I have access to screen readers, which is technology that allows my computer, my iPad, my iPhone to speak to me. So I have, what would traditionally be about, 10 or 15 devices. I have it now at the tips of my fingers. I can have a braille display with me, and that gives me a huge advantage. And even now, sadly, with us being in a pandemic, it's taken out the challenge of transportation, which is sometimes the biggest barrier faced by folks who are blind. Now you have, with remote working, you have access to a lot more employment opportunities that were previously unavailable. So there definitely are changes, but sometimes the biggest barriers that people face, whether we're talking about racism, sexism, or even ableism, is the attitudes of those who are making the hiring decisions. And that's where I think my father had to, they had to be trained on, how do you look your best, have your tie, your fedora, you smell good, your shoes shine, because you do not want to allow for any doubt to creep in as to your commitment or capability. But it oftentimes it was well beyond what was required for the job that they ultimately had access to, which were, a lot of service, oriented kind of jobs, low wages. So it definitely, I think for him, I think his dream is fulfilled in that, I'm able to live a life that is, very much different than what he went through. And I have that hope for my son, that his life is very much different and more full and vibrant than my own. But yeah, it is a challenge, because most blind people that we hear of are either musicians or, are they employed somewhere? And, a lot of times the answer is no.
I was interested when you talked about blindness as being a low incident disability. And until you said that, it's not something that I had thought about, actually. And so by that, what you mean is the low incident in terms of like per capita? Is that what that
for live births or for the population? That vision loss is something that it does not. I don't know the exact statistic as to how many blind people there are, but it is, you have to think that how many people do you know in your community who are blind? And definitely, when an indicator of a low incidence disability is sometimes of, people will say, oh, do you know Michael, or do you know,
Right.
Mel? And, it's always assumed that every blind person knows every blind person, another
Right.
blind person,
Right.
because, hey, we must, know each other because nobody else does.
It's not, I mean, I know that there's one of the challenges that I've heard people talk about is with when you're visually impaired, not being able to see across a room or the parking lot when there is somebody that you know in proximity, and like just how important it is to be greeted and acknowledged. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, that's huge. I mean, there's sometimes a sense of like social isolation. I mean, I know for me personally, during when we were isolating at home, doing the 6 feet distance thing,
Mm-hmm.
It was very hard to know who is around. And as a blind person, sometimes I need assistance, whether it was shopping for weeks on end. I couldn't go shopping for myself, and that was a case for many of my friends who either did not have access to online delivery because it was inundated with everybody,
Right. Right.
or no one felt comfortable in getting closer than 6 feet to assist someone.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's a big thing. It's just knowing that. I think for a lot of people, when they see a blind person, they kind of freeze. I'll notice this if I'm walking down the hallway, that I'll notice, someone kind of chatting or talking. And if I have my cane or my guide dog, they'll kind of stop talking. And I'm assuming they're looking at me, and I'm imagining that they're saying, okay, what do I do? Help? Do I not help? And I'm like, that's the opposite of what you should do, because then I don't know where you are as I'm moving along. But
Right.
I think that's where, as a society, we are getting better at recognizing that the lived experiences of how people show up in their bodies can be very, different, whether we're looking at how gender shows up in someone who identifies as male or female, or even ability, how that comes about. And I think people are starting to recognize that, hey, people with disabilities are gonna be everywhere, not just in kind of separate communities, which is where, when the Segregated Schools for the Blind started from, is out of a need for a separate community, because that's where the resources were, to now knowing that everyone should be able to live in the broader community with these different supports and resources in place locally.
It made me think of what you're saying, sort of an unintended consequence. So the schools for the blind come because that is a way for education and opportunity. But in so doing, with a residential school, the children are then removed from their communities, which has impact on the children, but it also has impact on the communities. And that's this unintended consequence now of the folks who are not at those schools and are staying in their home community and going to school, that they are then not experiencing life with visually impaired or blind people and getting to know people who are different than them in that way.
Yes. And that's actually a decision that my parents struggled with, because they a phrase that my dad always said, you're going to have to live in a sighted world, and the idea that you can have, a blind community and where you interact with only blind people, but everyone in let's say Greenbelt is not blind, so I'm going to have to learn how to adjust or face those types of misconceptions or questions or barriers. So for them, they decided for me that I would attend public school during the school year, and then the school for the blind at during the summers. And I definitely admire my parents for making that decision. I know it was really hard because we have to, I guess, in a way, acknowledge and understand that my dad had some really tough lived experiences as a Black man that may cause him to be either less trusting or hesitant or hyper aware of how he needs to act or be surrounded by white individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he always talked about at the white school they had this, or I think in his mind he was ready to make a decision to leave school if integration came while he was still there. Integration came after, I think a year or two after he graduated. But in his mind, he talks about that he would have decided to leave because of that fear of what would happen to those initial students who were entering into a desegregated space. We saw it with the Little Rock Nine. That's where we saw Minnie Jean. We saw the other 8 students just come with fierce resistance and opposition and just mistreatment just for wanting to go to school. So anyway, so for my parents, there weren't as many professionals who were trained in educating blind children who were Black or of other color. So they did have to ultimately extend that trust to those teachers who are white to say, will you ensure that our daughter who is Black and who is also blind will receive the best education? And I definitely have to kind of know that was an incredible decision to make for them.
It must have been very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think, and you said the same about your grandparents making the decision about your dad.
Yeah.
And that there's the agony of how to make a decision and what is the right decision. And I'm guessing some element where it feels like no decision that you make is going to be perfect, and you just have to do something that's very challenging.
Yeah, have a sense of faith, and so I know from my parents, they didn't have the standard and level of education that I was able to receive, but they were deeply committed. My unfortunately, the way that the approach to education for blind students at the time, a lot of people believe that every blind person learned Braille. But that was not the case. There was kind of a belief that if you had any remaining vision, that it is better to be seen as a sighted person than to appear blind. So that kind of went to reading print or just using your brain to remember everything so you don't have to write it down. Because how would you write it down? You don't have access to Braille. So for my dad, even though he is well knowledgeable, he is at some level functionally illiterate. I know that's a really hard thing to say, but that is he does not know Braille. He cannot read print. So, but every night growing up, when I had homework, they sat down with me at the dinner table, and after I would say for about the 5th grade, they could not help me with my homework, but they ensured that I had, a cousin or an auntie or, somebody from church who did have the ability to kind of tutor me in certain subject areas or prepare me for SATs or ACTs, even when they themselves did not have that capability. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a testament to their push for you and their belief in getting the best education. And I think recognizing what was denied
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. And just like little, since this is a library event, it's so interesting that like now, so growing up, my dad, he would use these, records, they were the hard records, and it was this huge, device that they would, use. And then it, went to the cassettes. And then now recently he was so excited that he got like a thumb drive that he could insert into a digital talking player that he could read books. And that's how he reads books. He reads way more books than I do. But as the technology is evolving, he's having to evolve with it. And he's always amazed as to like how different it is that you can fit 100 books on a small stick, compared to these large reams of records that you would have just for one book.
It is incredible because I think, and I know that we have behind the scenes who may just need to be prepared to suddenly jump on screen to answer this question, but I'm thinking that the library has, access to audiobooks that can be heard, like streamed from the internet, like that you don't need to download, right? That you can listen. I don't know.
Yeah. So actually, the National Library Service has a service called Bard, and you can actually download, audiobooks, or you can actually download the Braille format. So with a Braille display, I can read the book in Braille.
So what is you mentioned this before, and so can you what is Braille display? Is that like on a device?
Yeah, it's like a one-line device that now they're much more portable. They can be so we know that the Braille cell contains 6 dots. So you can have these small sequence or a line of 10, 14. They can go as wide as 40 cells or even 80 cells. But, they now come as small as 10 to 14 cells, and that can fit in your purse, essentially. And it can connect to through Bluetooth or some sort of Wi-Fi. They can connect wirelessly to a device, and I can read. And that's opened up a huge opportunity for folks who are deafblind as well.
I will just say that is shared on the screen, that people can go to learn more about accessible resources at the library by going to pgcmls.info/accessibility-services. So for anybody who's listening now and would like to have access to that, and there's also links that have been put into Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube chats as well that you can hyperlink from those directly if you are watching on one of those platforms. This has been, I just find this so interesting, and I want to circle back to the schools. And you had said something, and I definitely don't want you to say anything on the internet that you don't want to do. But one of the things you said is you put a shout out for any historians who are maybe interested in helping on the project, doing some research. So I want to circle back to that and be like, is that a serious call? And is there an email address that if you're willing to share, or can they write to, like, I could give my email address and I could forward it to you if there are people who are interested? Okay, I'm going to do it, everybody. I'm about to give my email address. And then
what I'm finding is that, when I went into this, it kind of started, peeling back the onion of, oh my goodness, this is going to take, whether it's, archivists or folks that are interested in looking in state records or the federal quota system that could list, where students came from or where the funding went, and, kind of putting the pieces together. And it's more than just what I can do by myself. And I would love to work with anyone that, wants to volunteer some time. Of course, I'm pursuing some funding to make it, happen. And I would love to work with a team, or at least form a team that can start working on this.
Okay, so I'm happy. I can give my contact information. If they reach out to me, I could forward it to you. Would that be good?
Yes.
Okay, I'm actually going to do it. It's khanington@co.pg.md.us, but I'm actually going to type that in and we'll get that in the chats for anybody who's listening who maybe is interested in doing a little bit of research or is an archivist and would be interested in taking on a little tiny piece of this project. I can forward your information to Dina, because I think it's, first of all, it sounds super interesting, and
Yeah.
I definitely am so interested in seeing the end result. And you were talking about doing a oral history project and a film. Is that right?
Possibly, yeah. I need to figure out. I mean, honestly, sometimes it's based on funding. Doing, now with let's say the StoryCorps technology, it's fairly easy to do an interview, but to kind of do it in a put those things together into a documentary or a video is going to take a bit more work. So it depends on how much resources I can find to actually, how much more complex it can be.
Mm-hmm.
But we, slightly connected, but what I'm also finding is that there were Black schools for the deaf, and some people may be curious that the American Sign Language that we see on display with interpreters and deaf individuals and such, we also know that Black individuals had their own set of language. Mm-hmm. So, and those came from those segregated schools for the deaf and also for the blind. So it's interesting tidbits. So
yeah, there's a lot of different culture that I think should be highlighted, and I think that there's sort of this dominant white certain economic strata, which is sort of moves from time to time, that is often, I think, presented as like mainstream culture, but actually it's just one culture. It is not, it is not normative. And I think to have those, the idea of having like ASL interpretation, but using not the main, I'm going to use mainstream after I just said not to use it, but the one that we see more often,
right?
And to try to diversify that. I think those are really good things to be aware of, I think, for folks.
Yeah. And especially since blindness, is congenital. It runs in the family. So that's where you do have the potential of uncovering generations of family members who are blind, and or who are, and so it becomes a much more exciting project.
So you said that you've talked to some of your dad's classmates, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us, is there any stories that you don't have to mention? I mean, you can mention names, but you don't have to. Any sort of stories that you'd like to highlight?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. There's so many. I mean, oh my goodness. I think the big thing is just knowing that they had, they weren't able to compete in the white schools for the blind, that they had their own separate league. We know about the Black baseball league, but just knowing that, hey, the experiences that we see sighted people have, whether it's music, dating, language, art, athleticism, it is very much mirrored in the experience of blind individuals. And so and that creativity of how you make that happen with limited resources, that is like that's ingenuity for me.
I know that we said that at 7:45 we'd start taking questions. We're a little early at 7:43, but we're gonna have O pop back up, who's here right now. Hi, O, welcome back to the conversation. And I'm wondering if you would like to ask any questions that have come in from the audience.
Definitely. I just first wanted to say thank you so much, Kyla and Dina. It's been a joy to listen to your discussion. And I know I have questions, so I'm excited to read some questions that came in. We have a question about Braille. Are you able to explain briefly the basics of Braille for someone who is a sighted person who doesn't have as much experience with Braille?
Yes. So Louis Braille created a system of dots to basically provide a tactile means for having access to information. Previously, there were other systems that used raised letters, but that was very difficult to replicate. because you had to have the individual, stencils to, or almost lettering for each one, and the sensitivity of fingers to kind of understand a particular shape of a imprinted letter, like what we have in our regular print alphabet. It becomes cumbersome very quickly. So Louis Braille devised a system of 6 dots. So they two columns, 3 rows, and each letter is represented by a combination of dots. And those letters, if they stand alone, can represent a word. So like the letter B is for but, C is for can, D is for do. And then if you put those together, like TMW is tomorrow, CD is could. So it becomes much more complex over time. But most people will see Braille on elevators, maybe ATMs that you would see. But Braille can be everywhere. It can be on paper that you create yourself. I have a Braille writer at home that I can label like my appliances or clothing if I need to. I have a little son, and I for the special board books that he has, I have Braille on those. And there's also organizations like the National Braille Press that have books that you can have both print and Braille. But now with technology, you can have Braille anywhere on small devices, like I mentioned earlier, like a Braille display.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you so much for letting us know about that, Dina. Also, another question we had was for people who are might be born sighted and later transition to a loss of sight, can that like make learning Braille more difficult? Is there a particularly developed sense of touch needed to learn Braille, or
Yeah. What we find is that the earlier that the philosophy that I had kind of shared earlier, that Braille was kind of only used for those who were totally blind, and those that had any remaining vision learned print. That approach has faded over time to encouraging that if any child has a significant level of vision loss, that Braille should be taught first, so that you kind of get a jump on that level of sensitivity in your hands or in your fingers for recognizing Braille. There are some Braille readers out there that can read 300 words a minute or more. and that is equivalent or even faster to what a sighted person can read in print. But what we know is that as a person is older, whether it's the sensitivity or just like any other person learning a new language or a new system, it's not as fast. I know that I read about 100 words a minute if I practice, continually. But if I don't use Braille on a daily basis, I know that my speed goes down. For someone who loses their sight later, there are training centers for the blind to go to, like Blind Industry and Services of Maryland. They have some training centers that are local to the area. There's the Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind in DC. And there's adult training centers all over the country that can provide support to adults who are losing their vision at various stages of adulthood. And Braille can be a part of that because, of course, you're going to need a way of writing down or accessing information. A lot of people as adults will use some type of recorded device because that's just the easiest way. Some people will use their own kind of shorthand for Braille. They may not can read 100 words or 300 words a minute, but if they want to know the difference between salt and pepper, and you don't want to go tasting everything, you can label it in an easy way. And that's what a lot of people find, is that you can use Braille is very versatile for what you need it for. It's just a matter of getting the proper training and practicing it and using it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Dina. I also just wanted to let everybody know I shared some links in the chat to the Maryland Library, Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, which is an awesome resource that is available to our patrons and patrons of any library across Maryland. The LBPD provides books and magazines in Braille, both through the mail and through digital download, and they have specialized format books that you can use for the digital talking book machine if people have that. And then also, like Dina mentioned, there are many e-audiobooks, both physical audiobooks and e-audiobooks available in our libraries, which we are always happy to help people access. And our website is designed to be ADA accessible for the blind and print disabled as well.
Awesome, thank you. So I have another question, and I want to circle back, and you touched on this a little bit, and I'm hoping you can give us a little bit more information as we talk about, and whether it's stories you've heard from your dad, but is there some way you can give us like an overview about what life was like for your dad in the school?
So, oh my goodness. So I know the facility that he went to, I think it was later turned into a nursing home, because you have, individual rooms. There's a dormitory side. So even for the time that I spent at the school, at the Arkansas School for the Blind, is very similar. Life is very similar in that you have rooms that have maybe 3 to 5 or 6 children living in kind of a dorm room setting. They weren't really built to have individual kind of quads that college students are known for. So the day starts at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. The house mother who lives there, or house father who lived there, would help the students get ready. And all of these students either stayed in dorms that were kind of segmented by age, but sometimes you had dorms where the students kind of were separated by wings in this one kind of home. And then a lot of them had kind of a cafeteria style, so every student would go to the cafeteria. But back then, the students would eat in a kitchen area. So the house mother or a cook would prepare meals for the students, and then that's where you would start lessons after that. They had all of the same courses like English, math, science, and history or social studies. And then they had some type of industrial arts or and physical education. Many of the schools for the blind did have athletic programs like wrestling, swimming, and track. You find those sports prevalent at the schools. The school day would end at 3:30, 4 o'clock, and then the students would go to dinner. Afterwards, go back to the dorms, and the day would continue on from there. During the weekends, school staff would take students out on outings within the community. I know for myself, the staff would take us to recently, like the 4th of July celebration. They tried to create just as much of similar experiences that any other sighted student would have. They tried to create those experiences for those blind students as well. So for my dad, I know that for the other boys that lived in the dorm, I mean they became like brothers, but the connection, the family, for some of them, you could see some of the disparities between those families who had either access to send clothing and kind of sweets or treats or stuff, and boys who didn't, or children who didn't.
Mm-hmm.
They all lived
Mm-hmm.
in that same kind
Right.
of space. So that's where you do kind of see this melting pot of who has access to what, but you have that same experience of vision loss.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a couple more questions.
Yeah, we have one from our dear Renee Battlebrooks at the Office of Human Rights, and her question and her thought is as follows: I'm reflecting on COVID and how, for me, touching anything outside the house caused great distress. Needing to read Braille in public, thereby touching surfaces, is something I did not think of. Can you comment on any other challenges during COVID in addition to those mentioned earlier?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, before COVID, I would, kind of, it would be kind of I don't want to say a treat, but it kind of indicator as to how accessible a place would be whether they had a Braille menu.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of touching a Braille menu, a paper Braille menu, that, God knows who has touched it and where it's been, it's like, ooh, no. So you do find a lot more blind folks that are accessing menus and information online. I know, just as a blind person, I carry a lot of hand sanitizer with me because just by nature, for my son, like any other parent, you're gonna, get some unknown object handed to you.
Definitely.
But instead of, just recently we had the cicadas. My son would, hand me something. I would not know what it was, and it had to be kind of strong and brave and not, recoil as to what I touch. But that's just life as a blind person. But with the pandemic and the awareness of how germs and viruses are spread, you do become aware of, hey, do I really want to touch this? Can I ask for more descriptive information?
Mm-hmm.
Recently, my son and I visited the aquarium, and they had touch bags, which is awesome that they
Mm.
3D models of the mammals that were there, because the mammals were in the water. I couldn't touch the water, go in and see how things, the experience of touching a jellyfish would not go well. But they had a 3D model of one so that I could get a concept of what it is. But with the pandemic in mind, and rightfully so from their perspective, they weren't handing those things out. So that's where the experience is of what are we going to do moving forward. It's going to be different, and that's where we want to make sure that, as facilities or services, that we are thinking of how people are accessing information, whether digitally or tactfully or by some other means.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I really appreciate your thoughts on that, especially I think we at the library we're traditionally associated with the printed word, but it has been important as we evolve as a space that is a community center and a learning resource for everyone to consider the needs of those who learn differently. And also tactile learning is important for people with many different kinds of abilities and needs. So having story time on the spectrum and things that are accessible for people with different kinds of tactile and sensory processing needs, having those kind of tactile programs. And just for anyone with any experience of ability, it can be such a big part of learning to be using all the senses and not just be like, okay, look at this picture of an animal. You're not learning.
That's what's kind of interesting. I know, for my son, pictures are a huge thing. But I remember one vivid experience. I know we're running low on time, but one of the things that they had a summer kind of theme of planes, trains, automobiles, or something. And as a blind person, if someone says the word plane, and if I don't have access to what a plane looks like visually, how do I understand how does a plane fly? You know, what is the crew?
Mm-hmm.
So the School for the Blind, they actually worked with, you know, the airport. This was pre 9/11, but they worked with the airport and actually had an airplane on the, you know, the tarmac for students to walk the length of and touch the wings and get a sense of actively engaging with something that would otherwise be, you know, inaccessible, but it's something that is common knowledge to everyone who isn't blind. So that summer we took, you know, a ride on a helicopter. We
Oh, wow.
I'm sure I can only imagine the level of paperwork they had to do to do that. But we took a ride on a helicopter. We rode a tethered hot air balloon. But again, it was those kinds of experiences that those educators were really aware of. How can we kind of translate these experiences and common knowledge that are gained visually? How can we adapt those in a non-visual way? And that's sometimes that is the beauty of having schools for the blind or programs that are really tailored to kids of different populations.
Mm-hmm.
That is so awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I also think, sorry about that. That's a like a wonderful place to end, an exciting way to think about education for all people and the importance of, you know, just having a variety of ways that we explore the world. And I'm thrilled that you are like in technology, which can be such a place of homogeny and are, you know, encouraging and expanding the world of learning. And we're very excited for your upcoming documentary. So
Thank you.
thank you again, Dina, for joining us. I wanted to let everybody know that they can follow Dina on Twitter at Dina Lambert 01. So that's DENNA LAMBERT 01. And that you can again learn more about accessible resources at the library and throughout Maryland at pgcmls.info/accessibility-services. Thank you so much, Kyla, for joining us today as well. We are so thrilled to continue this series of events with the Office of Human Rights. You can see all of our upcoming events with the OHR at tinyurl.com/PGCHRC events. And I'm going to shout out a couple of those because we are really excited. Let's see if I have them up here.
I did lean over and get some props. So I'm ready. Okay, I'm ready.
You got them?
I got them.
Okay.
Ready.
So tomorrow, so don't touch that dial. Tomorrow, Wednesday, July 14th at 7 p.m., we will have Ken Woodley to talk about his book, The Road to Healing, a civil rights reparations story in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which is going to be an excellent and needed discussion. We're thrilled to have that. And then on Tuesday, July 20th at 7 p.m., we're going to have Kendra Allen, the esteemed writer, talk about her new collection called The Collection Plate. So that is going to be thrilling. And then on July 27th, which is also a Tuesday at 7 p.m., we'll have another wonderful. Oh, look, you've got all the props. We'll have another.
Dina, I'm holding up the books that always introducing. I'm waving them slowly across my face.
Yeah, she's doing quite a dramatic.
Hi,
it's very cute.
Can you say hi?
So Kyla and hi.
Hi,
oh my goodness. Looked away for 1 second and you have an even more exciting prop than a book.
Books are over. Let's talk about Caleb.
Yeah, that's another. That's our private discussion. After party. So we will be joining Michelle Hamiel to talk about The Elephant We Don't See, Diversity Dialogue about the Killers of the Flower Moon. So that by David Grand, that's Tuesday, July 27th at 7 p.m. And you can watch all of our previous collaborative events with Office of Human Rights on YouTube, and visit pgcmls.info/events for all of our upcoming events that we're doing at the library as well for families of all ages, and we're having some in person outside as well. So that's really exciting. Thank you again, Dina. We're thrilled to have you. So everyone have a beautiful night, and see you tomorrow, hopefully. Bye.